I never thought I'd be standing knee-deep in my own pasture, watching water swallow up my fence posts, while Karen from the HOA sipped Chardonnay on her porch like the queen of catastrophe. The storm hadn't even hit yet. This was just the prelude. And there she was, grinning, watching my land turn into a swamp, completely unaware that the very water she'd redirected was about to flood her brand-new basement. But let me back up. I've lived on this little patch of land for nearly 20 years, tucked right on the edge of the neighborhood, where the town ends and the wild begins. I keep things simple: a small garden, a few chickens, a weathered old barn, and most importantly, a drainage ditch I dug with my own 2 hands when I first bought the place. To the HOA types, it probably looked insignificant, but to me, and to everyone within a quarter mile, it was essential. That ditch kept our corner of town from becoming a swamp after every downpour. It wasn't just mine, it was the neighborhood's unsung hero. Even the nosy old-timers who'd grumble about my unkempt hedges would tip their hats and mutter thanks when the ditch kept their yards dry after a spring storm. Then Karen moved in. 3 years ago, fresh off selling an overpriced condo in the city, she immediately declared herself queen of the HOA. No one elected her. She just showed up with clipboards, PowerPoints, and a mission to civilize us country folk. At first it was laughable. She tried to tell people to repaint barns, banished lawn gnomes, and made rules about grass height as if we lived in a suburban cul-de-sac instead of the edge of the woods. But when she set her sights on my drainage ditch, the laughing stopped. It started with a passive-aggressive note pinned to my gate with a sunflower-shaped magnet. Your ditch is unsightly and non-compliant with HOA aesthetic guidelines. Kindly restore it to match community standards. I nearly choked on my coffee. The ditch, the very thing keeping our homes from flooding, was apparently non-compliant? I crumpled the note and ignored it, thinking there's no way she'd push further. But oh, was I wrong. A week later, I returned from town to find 2 men I'd never seen before, some fly-by-night landscapers with more tattoos than tools, blocking the ditch. They were shoveling dirt, dumping rocks, and worst of all, stacking decorative boulders like it was a rustic garden feature. Karen stood to the side, arms crossed, looking mighty pleased with herself. "What in the world are you doing?" I demanded, stomping through the mud. "Fixing an eyesore," she replied like I should be grateful. "That eyesore is the only reason your petunias haven't floated away every spring." I snapped. She waved me off. "The HOA has voted, the ditch goes." They hadn't. There had been no meeting, but Karen's word in this neighborhood carried the weight of law. I tried to explain calmly how the runoff from the hills funneled right through this ditch. Without it, the water would back up, flood everyone's yards, and when it got bad enough, pour into their basements. But Karen wasn't interested in reason. She just wanted things to look pretty, and she always got what she wanted, or at least she thought she did. That night, I walked the property, flashlight in hand, checking runoff points and worrying. The next morning, sure enough, we got hit with a mild rain. Nothing even close to a storm, just a steady spring shower. And before long, the water started pooling. It soaked the lower parts of my pasture, creeping up toward the henhouse. Worse yet, it wasn't just my land suffering. I saw puddles forming down the road and my neighbors all out in boots and with buckets, scratching their heads, wondering why their yards looked like rice paddies. And there was Karen, standing on her perfectly dry porch, watching it all like she was admiring a sunset. I marched over to her place that afternoon, mud clinging to my boots, and confronted her. Caked on my boots, I stood there, seething. "Karen, you've got to unblock the ditch before this gets worse." I called out, my voice tight with frustration. She took a sip of her wine, barely acknowledging me. "It's just rain." "Deal with it," she replied, her tone dripping with smugness. No apology. No recognition of the problem. Just pure, unshakable confidence. I walked back to my place fuming, not just because my land was getting soaked but because I knew something Karen clearly didn't. I knew that in 3 days, the mother of all spring storms was headed straight for us. I'd seen the radar and listened to the old-timers, who could read clouds better than any weatherman. This wasn't just a heavy rain, it was the kind of storm people talked about for years. And thanks to Karen's little landscaping project, all the water had nowhere to go, except right toward her basement. What Karen didn't realize, and what made me smile despite my frustration, was that I wasn't just going to sit back and watch my place turn into a pond. She wanted to block my ditch, fine. I'd just make sure the water found a new path, one that happened to lead straight to her precious basement. And when I tell you it was going to be biblical, I'm not exaggerating. When nature gets even, it doesn't knock. It kicks the door down, and Karen was about to get the welcome of a lifetime. Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore, she was a full-blown threat to every property on this side of the neighborhood. After seeing how even a mild rain had caused problems, I knew the next storm would do more than water her petunias. It would flood basements, drown lawns, and cost people thousands, all because Karen thought a functional drainage ditch was ugly. That night, I paced my porch, listening to the quiet drip of the leftover rain, knowing full well that the storm coming wouldn't be so gentle. I wasn't angry anymore. No, something deeper was stirring. Resolve. I wasn't about to let Karen sink me and the rest of the neighborhood just because she preferred tidy landscaping over common sense. The next morning, I tried one more time to be reasonable. I knocked on Karen's door, trying to keep my frustration in check. She answered, wearing one of those HOA-branded polo shirts, like she was the president of something more important than a busybody committee. I calmly laid it all out for her: the forecast, the runoff patterns, the history of the ditch, and the threat of the coming storm. I even offered to help beautify the area if we could just clear it first. Karen smiled, that syrupy sweet smile she always wore when she thought she was winning. If you spend as much time fixing up your property as you do worrying about imaginary problems, you'd be HOA material. Then, without a second glance, she shut the door in my face. I stood there blinking, trying to process it. It wasn't just that she ignored the problem, it was that she seemed to enjoy it. She wanted me to suffer. Maybe it was some city versus country thing, or maybe she thought flooding my place would force me to sell. Whatever it was, she wasn't going to change her mind. I walked back to my land, staring at the clogged ditch, water already trickling ominously across the flat, saturated earth. I could almost hear my old neighbor Earl's voice in my head. Water's like a stubborn mule. Tell it where to go or it'll decide for itself. That's when it hit me. If Karen wanted to block the water's path, I'd simply help it find a new one. About 50 yards behind Karen's house, hidden under years of overgrowth and forgotten brush, was the old stormwater path. Decades ago, it had carried overflow when the ditch reached capacity, back when this land was part of a much larger farm. Most folks probably didn't even know it existed anymore, but I did. And it just so happened to slope downhill right toward the backside of Karen's lot, where it emptied directly into the foundation of what used to be a root cellar, which Karen had proudly converted into a wine-tasting basement. The irony was almost too perfect. That evening, I called up Jeb, an old friend and one of the few neighbors who wasn't afraid of Karen's so-called authority. When I told him the plan, he laughed so hard I thought he might fall off his porch. But he agreed to help. With 2 days left before the storm, we set out under cover of night to trench. We spent the rest of the night clearing brush and digging just enough to reactivate the old stormwater path, making it look as natural as possible. We didn't need to do much. The land already wanted to drain that way. All we had to do was give it a little nudge. By sunrise, we'd finished laying down a small, nearly invisible trench, using hand tools and some old knowledge. It wasn't flashy, but it didn't need to be. Would do the trick. Jeb slapped me on the back, admiring our work, and said with a grin, "That's going to be one heck of a housewarming gift." I couldn't help but smile. We weren't breaking anything, or even technically damaging Karen's property. We were just offering nature an option, and nature always takes the path of least resistance. Later that day, Karen strutted around the neighborhood, calling for an emergency HOA meeting. Of course, I wasn't invited, but in a small town, word travels fast. By sundown, I had heard all about it. Karen had decreed a new rule. All unsightly drainage ditches had to be approved aesthetically and could be modified or removed at the discretion of the HOA president, meaning herself. Most folks rolled their eyes but nodded along, fearing fines or worse. What really got me, though, was learning that Karen had planned a grand HOA mixer in her basement for the very night the storm was set to hit. You couldn't write irony like that. The next day, while everyone else buzzed about the party preparations and Karen's latest list of arbitrary fines, I quietly reinforced my own property. Sandbags went up along the henhouse, barn, and lower edge of my field. I added extra gravel to the driveway and cleared a few stray branches to prevent clogs in the higher runoff areas. By the time the sun set, I was ready. Karen, on the other hand, was busy hanging string lights and setting up folding tables. From a distance, I watched as caterers wheeled cases of wine into her house, oblivious to what was about to unfold. That night, the first bands of the storm rolled in. Distant thunder growled like some old god waking up, and the wind picked up enough to make the trees whistle. Karen's house glowed like a lighthouse in the darkness, full of people clinking glasses and toasting to whatever nonsense she had cooked up at the meeting. I stood on my porch, dry and ready, watching the rain begin to fall. At first, it was light, then harder, until it became a steady curtain of water beating down on everything. I could already see the difference. The blocked ditch swelled, water bubbling over the edges and spilling toward the path Jeb and I had cleared. Sure enough, it obeyed, rushing happily down the old route straight toward Karen's backyard. I didn't need to check twice. I knew exactly where it was headed, right into her wine-tasting basement. As the storm reached its peak, with wind howling and rain falling sideways, I saw the telltale flicker from Karen's windows. The lights dimmed, flickered again, and finally went dark. Somewhere out there, Karen and her guests were about to get their first taste of country-style justice. The best part? No one could blame me. After all, it was just water, and water always finds its way. The storm hit like a freight train. No warning. No mercy. By midnight, the wind was howling so loudly it rattled the window panes, and sheets of rain pummeled everything with a force you only see once or twice in a lifetime. I stood on my porch, dry as a bone behind the sandbags I'd set up, watching the chaos unfold like I had front row seats to Mother Nature's grand performance. The blocked ditch looked like it was about to burst, water swirling and backing up across the lower end of my property before obediently following the trench Jeb and I had carefully carved. I could just make out Karen's backyard through the rain and wind, the water pouring like a newborn creek, winding its way straight for her foundation. What struck me wasn't just how effective the diversion was, it was how perfectly nature had done the heavy lifting. The water wasn't raging like a river. It was smooth, steady, and merciless, slipping past Karen's manicured flower beds and heading straight into the cracks around her precious basement door, the faint glow of string lights still twinkling under the patio, oblivious to the doom creeping in from behind. It was a scene I could only imagine. Karen had spared no expense on this HOA gathering, hyping it up for weeks as the spring renewal gala, whatever that meant. From what I could gather, there were catered hors d'oeuvres, a wine snob from the city flown in to lead tastings, and half the neighborhood crammed into her basement, probably pretending to enjoy themselves to avoid fines. I could picture it clearly, guests swirling their glasses, nodding along to Karen's speech about refining the community, while, unnoticed, water quietly seeped beneath their feet. But water doesn't stay shy for long. Just as I settled back into my porch chair with a thermos of coffee, I saw it, the flicker. The basement lights dimmed once, then twice before cutting out completely. Seconds later, a high-pitched screech pierced the storm, clear enough to carry all the way to my property. I couldn't help but chuckle. Karen's party had just discovered their new water feature. The next half hour played out like a soap opera, and from the glow of my porch light, I could make out panicked silhouettes rushing up from the basement, slipping and stumbling, dragging soaked tablecloths and wine bottles behind them. Guests bolted into the storm, holding coats over their heads, ankle-deep in the new pond forming in Karen's backyard. Some tried to pull their cars free from the quickly flooding street, only to find themselves stuck as the blocked ditch forced water to spill over the road. And then there was Karen, on her porch, arms flailing, barking orders at anyone within earshot, though no one seemed too eager to listen. I don't think I'll ever forget the moment our eyes met across the storm. She pointed, drenched and furious, shouting something I couldn't hear over the wind. I just lifted my coffee in a silent toast. I wasn't smug exactly, just satisfied. The next morning, the storm broke as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind a muddy, drenched world. My property was intact. The sandbags had done their job, the redirected water had gone exactly where I wanted, and my garden, henhouse, and barn stood unharmed. Karen's house, however, was another story. The neighborhood buzzed with gossip before the sun had even dried the puddles. It turns out Karen's basement had flooded worse than anyone expected. The water had found every weak point and poured in relentlessly, expensive wine racks ruined, fancy imported rugs destroyed, and to top it off, the electrical system had shorted out spectacularly, leaving scorch marks on the walls. It wasn't just a little water damage, it was a full-blown disaster. Karen wasted no time launching into damage control, calling an emergency HOA meeting and dragging everyone into the waterlogged mess that used to be her pride and joy. The sight of her standing in rubber boots, trying to salvage her soaked sofa, should have earned her an award. But what really stole the show was her furious declaration that someone, meaning me, must have sabotaged her property. When she tried to pin it on me directly, I calmly stepped forward, reminded everyone about the blocked drainage ditch and how I'd warned her and tried to prevent this. Then, without a word, I played the recording I'd taken of Karen's private HOA meeting, where she'd proudly declared that she didn't care if the whole neighborhood flooded, as long as the ditch was gone. A heavy silence settled in, thick as fog. Karen's usual supporters suddenly found their boots fascinating, and no one came to her defense, not one person. Slowly, heads turned my way, not with blame but with gratitude. Folks realized that I hadn't caused the flood, Karen had. She had ignored warnings, broken rules, and gambled with everyone's homes to stroke her ego. That afternoon, Karen was seen hauling wet furniture out of her basement, trying to salvage what little dignity she had left. A few brave souls stopped by to help, but most, like me, kept their distance. Word spread fast, and by sundown, it wasn't just the neighborhood gossiping about Karen's flooded basement, it was the whole town. Small towns have long memories, and nothing travels faster than a scandal soaked in irony. I thought maybe that would be the end of it, that Karen would quietly fix up her house and keep to herself for a while. But I should have known better. Karen wasn't the type to learn a lesson gracefully. No, she had one more desperate card to play. That evening, as the sun finally peeked out from behind the storm clouds, Karen marched up to my gate, boots squelching in the mud, waving a soggy clipboard like it was a royal decree. "You're responsible for this," she shouted, her voice hoarse. "You did something to make the water go into my basement." I leaned against the fence, arms crossed, letting the moment hang. "I didn't do anything, Karen," I said with a smile. "Water just follows the path of least resistance. You blocked the right path, so it found a new one." Her jaw worked, trying to come up with a reply, but all she could do was sputter before storming off, leaving deep boot prints in the mud. As she retreated back to her soggy, wine-soaked kingdom, I couldn't help but think, maybe, just maybe, the storm wasn't the only thing that had been overdue. The days after the flood were eerily quiet. The usual hum of lawnmowers, neighborly chatter, and the occasional rooster crow were replaced with the sound of some pumps and contractors stomping through Karen's property, hauling out waterlogged furniture, ruined drywall, and soggy boxes labeled with cursive words like seasonal decor and fine china. Folks from around the neighborhood passed by, some with polite nods, others openly gawking, but no one offered much sympathy. Karen had ruled over the neighborhood like a self-declared queen, and now her kingdom was underwater, literally. But the biggest surprise wasn't how bad Karen's basement was, it was how quickly the rest of the neighborhood turned on her. By midweek, whispers had turned to outright complaints. One neighbor after another started talking about all the fines they'd paid under Karen's so-called leadership, the hedge trimming citations, the mailbox color codes, the petty threats over garden gnomes and lawn chairs. All of it resurfaced like debris floating up from Karen's flooded basement. At first, I just listened, keeping my distance. I wasn't about to poke the hornet's nest after everything that had happened. But then Earl, the oldest and grumpiest neighbor on the block, came knocking on my door. "We're holding a meeting. A real one. No Karen nonsense," he said with a nod. "You'd best be there. When the town grumps start organizing, you know something serious is brewing." That Friday night, a good 24 neighbors crammed into Earl's barn. There were no clipboards, no HOA logos, and no Karen in sight, just regular folks tired of being bullied by someone who barely understood the land she lived on. As I stood by the coffee urn, I listened as neighbors shared stories of Karen's meddling, finding a veteran for flying a slightly oversized flag, threatening to evict an elderly widow over a chipped fence post, and my personal favorite, trying to find someone's toddler for drawing chalk art on the sidewalk. The more people spoke up, the clearer it became that Karen wasn't just disliked, she was despised. By the time the meeting ended, the room had unanimously decided to call for an official vote to remove Karen as HOA president. Karen, who usually manipulated meetings to her advantage, would have no power this time. Every rule she had weaponized was about to turn on her, and I didn't have to lift a finger. The very people who once followed her out of fear were now fed up and emboldened. The flood hadn't just ruined her basement, it had broken the dam holding back everyone's frustration. The vote happened the following week, and it was the most packed HOA meeting in memory, standing room only, with even folks from outside the neighborhood sneaking in just to witness the spectacle. Karen arrived late, still looking damp despite the sunny weather, clutching her clipboard like it was a life raft. She tried to steer the meeting as usual, rambling about regulations and protocol, but no one was paying attention. Earl, bless him, stood up, cleared his throat and said, "We're voting." No preamble, no nonsense. The votes were counted right then and there, with Karen watching helplessly as tally after tally piled against her. When the final count was read, not a single hand had been raised to keep her in power, not one. Karen didn't even stick around to argue. She grabbed her clipboard, muttered something about ungrateful country folk, and stormed out, leaving behind a stunned silence that quickly turned into cheers. I thought maybe she'd go quietly after that, lick her wounds and try to regain control later. But Karen was Karen, and Karen didn't know how to lose gracefully. The very next day, a for sale sign appeared in her yard, leaning slightly because the ground was still too soft from the floodwater. No one rushed to buy. Rumor had it that every potential buyer was greeted by a musty basement smell and a long list of repair costs that sent them running. Some said Karen tried to blame it all on the weather. Others said she hinted at sabotage. But the truth was clear, written right there in the dirt. She had blocked the only thing keeping the stormwater in check, and it had turned on her. The best part, if I'm honest, was watching the neighborhood come alive again without Karen breathing down everyone's neck. People started fixing things on their own terms. The Jones family rebuilt their garden fence without worrying about matching paint colors. Old Mrs. Harper got to keep her ceramic flamingos without anyone writing her up. Kids rode bikes and left chalk drawings all over the sidewalks, and no one cared. The place felt like a community again, not a gated prison. A few weeks later, with the help of a few neighbors, I rebuilt the ditch properly, wider and deeper, so it could handle whatever storm came next. Folks brought lemonade and sandwiches, making it feel like a community event. Earl even cracked a smile and said, "Name it the Karen Canal." The name stuck faster than I expected, and soon enough the whole neighborhood was calling it that, as if it had always been. As for Karen, she stuck around just long enough to host one last desperate open house, which ended with potential buyers stepping ankle-deep into her still damp basement. After that, the for sale sign came down quietly, and word spread that she had packed up and left overnight. No one saw her go, and honestly no one cared to. One evening, not long after, I found myself back on my porch watching the sunset, while the ditch hummed quietly with the last trickles of runoff from a spring shower. The land was calm again. The neighborhood too. And while I wasn't one for revenge stories, I couldn't help but feel like this one had written itself just right. Karen's flood wasn't just water. It was every bad decision, every power-hungry rule, every petty fine finally catching up to her. I took one last sip of coffee and glanced at the ditch, now a clean, strong channel weaving gently along the edge of my property. The birds were back, the frogs were singing, and the neighbors were laughing again. For once, the town didn't just feel like home, it felt like ours. And somewhere out there, I hoped Karen found herself a neighborhood with no ditches, no storms, and maybe, just maybe, a mirror. Because if there was one thing this whole mess taught me, it's that you can try to block the water, you can fight it, ignore it, even find it, but in the end it always finds its way, just like people.